Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time zone you happen to be in. I'm Monette Zard. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm the director of the program on forced migration and health at Columbia University's Mailman School. And on behalf of my colleagues in the program and also colleagues in the Global Governance and Justice program, we'd like to welcome you to today's discussion. I should note at the outset that thanks to our wonderful colleagues at Los Andes University, this webinar is being simultaneously translated. So for those of you who would prefer to hear this in Spanish, you can find the interpretation button in the bottom right hand of your Zoom screen and select your preferred language, either Spanish or English, and you'll hear the webinar in that through the miracle of technology. So our moderator for today's event is Dr. Arturo Harker, Associate Professor in the School of Government at the Los Andes University in Bogota, Colombia. Dr. Harker is an expert in applied microeconomics and quantitative public policy evaluation. He is going to lead us today in this discussion, which will explore family violence prevention in the context of COVID-19 and forced displacement. We could ask for no one better as a moderator. His research has focused on studying the impact of adverse childhood experiences, such as exposure to violence, crime, and forced displacement, as well as extreme poverty, on the development of cognitive, social, and emotional abilities. And really his work has focused on designing and evaluating interventions to help mitigate these impacts. He is an economist by training and an expert in public policy evaluation. And without further ado, I propose to hand it over to him to lead us in what promises to be a really fascinating discussion this morning. Thank you, Arturo, over to you.
Thank you, Monette, for that great introduction. So today we have two objectives in this event. We first want to highlight the magnitude of the problem we have in hand and all the ways in which this problem has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. But especially we want to focus on showcasing the work of organizations all around the world that are actually facing this challenge in humanitarian settings. I have the pleasure of presenting this amazing panelist group. I'm going to present them in the chronological order in which they will intervene in the panel. So first I'll introduce Dr. Golin Samari. She's a public health demographer whose research focuses on social inequities and health. Taking a health justice approach, she examines how racism, gender inequities, and migration-based inequities and xenophobia shape population health both domestically and globally, with a particular focus on communities in or from the Middle East and North Africa. She largely focuses on issues related to immigrant health, women's health, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. So Goleen is going to share with us the result of a collective work we've done on highlighting the issues and the ways in which the pandemic have affected violence prevention, family violence prevention. So I'm gonna present each of our panelists before their intervention. And so we just as a way of connecting the dots. So over to you, Goleen.
Thank you, Arturo, for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So I have the pleasure of really presenting collective work that we've done around family violence in the context of COVID-19 in forced displacement settings. And this is work led by a consortium, which I'll introduce throughout my remarks. So we all know that crises are never age and gender neutral, and COVID-19 is no exception to that. And so we've seen how the pandemic has widened existing gender and economic inequities. And we've also seen how these inequities are really associated with issues of family violence, including intimate partner violence, violence against children, and gender-based violence. So humanitarian settings are really characterized by high population density, limited access to preventative and curative health services, poor water, sanitation, and hygiene services, things like distrust of authorities, poor governance, and a lot of increasing stigma and discrimination. And so because of this, displaced women and girls and boys already face an increased risk for family violence. For example, 70% of women experience gender-based violence in humanitarian contexts compared to 35% worldwide. And globally, half of our children ages 2 through 17 years have experienced violence against children. And in 2016, we had 50% or more of our children in Asia and Africa and North America experiencing such violence just in the last year alone. So why are migrants and refugees more vulnerable? So it's really the simultaneous aggravation of risk factors and erosion of protective factors that's amplified in humanitarian settings, where women, girls, and boys are often cut off from institutional service providers and resources. In particular, the disruption of social and protective networks, such as extended families and communities, may really exacerbate family violence and its consequences. For instance, women can have less contact with family and friends who provide support and protection from violence from a partner, and perpetrators may further restrict access to services, help, and psychosocial support. Across the globe, we've seen that domestic violence and family violence has been exacerbated by quarantine measures as victims and survivors are really confined with their abusers. UNFPA predicted early on in the pandemic that we would see 15 million additional cases of gender-based violence for every 3 months of lockdown. So just the available evidence really suggests that COVID-19 and the associated isolation measures have led to a rise in family violence in many countries, if not globally. According to the Unhcr-led Global Protection Center, 19 out of 21 GBV subclusters involved in humanitarian response reported that GBV is occurring, and over 60% said that it's due to the COVID-19 crisis. In April 2020, UNFPA released new projections predicting an additional 31 million cases of GBV. They also predicted an additional 13 million cases of child and early marriage in the next decade due to COVID-19 disruptions. So the economic vulnerability is really multifaceted and really could lead to increase in child labor and child marriage. So this chart on the left just basically shows that, you know, between March and April of 2020 alone, there were 238 femicides and almost 164,000 GBV related calls in Latin America and the Caribbean. So some evidence that we found specific to humanitarian crisis contexts in putting together this knowledge brief. We saw that in an assessment conducted in Lebanon in May 2020, there were 12% of Syrian refugees reported an increase in intimate partner violence and a 29% increase in violence against children. UN Women conducted an assessment with vulnerable women in Jordan and found that 62% of respondents reported an increased risk of emotional and physical violence, and 54% attributed this to economic hardships. In the Colombian border territory with Venezuelan migrants, there's been a 33% increase in demand for GBV-related services during the period of strict confinement and a 113% increase in forced recruitment of children by armed groups. We often see that children are the first victims of armed conflict, as we've observed this week in Gaza. During the COVID-19 pandemic, underreporting has been exacerbated, particularly in these displacement contexts. So you not only have confinement with abusers, but you also have issues of underreporting. So the International Rescue Committee reports a 50% increase in GBV in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, and a 30% decrease in Tanzania in reports between February and March of 2020. In refugee hosting countries such as Greece and Lebanon, you also have discriminatory movement restrictions that have been placed on refugees, making it more difficult for women to leave the household and report cases or seek necessary medical and legal services. So we propose, sort of a 7 or 6-pronged approach. So you have to have continuity of protective prevention and response strategies, which means that we have to advocate for the inclusion of gender-based violence and violence against children response services as an essential service, and ensure that they're included in preparedness and response planning for COVID-19 and appropriately resourced as a part of that planning. We have to adapt safe spaces to adhere to physical distancing protocols so that they remain open. We have to guarantee the continuity of services and provide relevant remote service delivery. We have to identify alternative entry points for survivors to seek help. We have to strengthen community protection mechanisms, and we have to promote positive and supportive relationships within and between communities. So key messages from this report are really that COVID-19 has exacerbated the risk factors leading to an increase in family violence, that services that respond to family violence must be considered essential services, and violence prevention strategies must be adapted to the pandemic and guided by priorities identified by displaced women, girls, and boys. Just to acknowledge those who've contributed to the report and the consortium of individuals that were involved in the work that made this report possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Goleen. So the plan is, after this brief introduction to the knowledge brief we constructed, is to have the intervention of 4 specialists coming from 4 different organizations, and they will share their experience trying to deliver services that are related to violence prevention and family prevention during the pandemic. So I'm very happy to introduce now our first panelist, Emmanuel Neisa. Emmanuel holds a BA in political science and a master in communications from Sciences Po Paris. He's a publisher of children's book, a specialist in creation of educational content, and director of Clickarte, a pedagogical agency in Bogota. He has led educational projects for organizations including UNICEF, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, UNHCR, the European Union, and over 50 educational institutions. Welcome, Emmanuel.
Hola, muchas gracias por
Hello to everyone. Thank you very much for this space. Hello, Arturo. Hello, Monette, and the other panelists and the public in general. I'm here to present a strategy that we've developed with UNICEF last year during the pandemic. And it was, how do we cater to more than 100,000 students? 4,000 of them are migrants, and deploy an educational curriculum during an emergency that would allow us to have social, emotional help and will allow us to continue with learning in these uncertain times. The truth is, that's what we're based on, and how to create curriculums to work with resilience in uncertain times, such as what we lived last year. When we speak about last year, from the situation that so many families had to go through, well, it made us think quite a bit on what a shipwreck can be. A shipwreck where these places, where these ships which were the schools. The ships were the schools. The ships were the places where we had protection for migrants. And one way or another, they stopped working. These ships are no longer there, or they're broken. And each of these migrant families, they started to be shipwrecked in their own little small little boat, trying to find a horizon and disconnected from the rest of the system, with high tension and emotional tiredness, stress, economic stress, and also obviously all kinds of other stresses that generate violence, and very concrete needs, which are very similar to those people that are stuck in a shipwreck setting, which is the need to have routines, or those confinement spaces which are so small, where they have to live with so many different people, and where many children have to live with their perpetrators of their crimes. And during this shipwreck that COVID represents, and the arrival of the pandemic, for attention centers, for schools, all the different questions that we asked ourselves were, how can we provide for children and for families? How can we allow them to have strategies to strengthen their socioeconomic needs and emotional needs? And at the same time, with this shipwreck and the series of different isolated people that are in the high seas right now, how could we actually weave together those links between the educational community and not allow these children to be just continue to drift? It was important to create a strategy that would allow the instance to have more cohesion. We needed community. And at the end of the day, a third purpose or objective was, how do we open up conversations within the families about what was happening? Not in terms of immediate reaction, but more in reflection terms. There were very confusing times for everyone, I think. And I know that all the strategies sought to be able to weave together to detonate those conversations or trigger them within families, so that each person in a family can give their own opinions, and we can navigate these turbulent waters and those difficulties and open up those difficult conversations. And we did this via a universe of learning that we've been working on since 2014, which is called The Village, and Aldea in Spanish. And that's a place where we have a series of people, and those people that live in this village will allow the children to identify themselves with different personalities. And these characters will allow us to model different behaviors. And the strategy, what this creates, is to create history with these people that are very similar to us, and to create histories which are metaphors of real life. It's what did we do to weave a curriculum that would dialogue with the context, that would allow us to speak about confinement, that would allow us to speak about the virus, that would allow us to speak about the emotional stress that we were living. So these characters allowed us in one way or another to deploy this curriculum. This curriculum was in fact created via books. We distributed more than 100 books in 17 different states in Colombia departments, more than 100,000 students participating, 4,000 were migrants. The idea that each child was able to have their own book to be able to work at home. We also had radio shows, digital material as well. And via these stories, we were able to provide to families strategies so that they were able to reflect upon what was happening and to be able to strengthen their abilities and capacities. So within this strategy, we also included all the issue related to mindfulness, which we thought was fundamental in very reduced stressful situations. So we have videos in the strategy, we have radio programs. We actually transmitted quite a bit in the region of Barranquilla. There are activities like breathing activities. And what we saw is that throughout the whole country, children of every region started to adopt many of these strategies, and teachers as well. It's worthwhile mentioning that we trained more than 5,000 teachers in working with this methodology, which allowed teachers as well to have more visibility at the time where they were communicating with their students, with their families, and have much more clear and concrete communication. This curriculum was a cross-cutting curriculum. It had, with one same book, we can work language, arts, science, math, social emotional work. The idea is that this would be a curriculum that was holistic, integrated by the different needs that the system had. And within this ocean of different separate ships, we were able to come to a one same channel and symphony. All of these materials, what they allowed, and they actually called to do family activities. activities. They opened up conversations within the family so that people could ask their grandfather something and find knowledge of each of the different family members and weave within a family different sorts of dynamics. Many times the conversations within families are conversations which are very logistical about what's for food, about money, about where we're going to sleep tonight. When we speak with our family members and with the people that live around us or are in immigrant situations, obviously logistics absorb most of the conversation and most of the time in family conversations. The idea here was to open up different types of conversations, leave that mindset, and this universe, this fantasy universes allowed us to actually accomplish just this. Then a series of opportunities and the books. We had 2 different books that were distributed to 100,000 students. As I said, within these activities, in these books, we had activities, and then we started to rethink how we organized our day. I think there's a very important issue here, which is the issue of autonomy. Despite the kids being at home with their families, well, many times the families don't have time or the same emotional stress does not allow them to actually cooperate or make families to always congregate. So the book itself and the methodology and the digital setting and radio has to allow us to have autonomous work on behalf of the children. Though a child that does not have access to an older family member should be able to still accomplish the methodology by himself or herself. And that's what we saw. Many children that were disconnected from this continued with the methodology. I'm not sure if you guys can see this. I know we have very little time, but let me see if I can play this. But this is basically some of the links that we created. It's not working for some reason. Oh, well, it's not working. But basically, it's what we did so that children can also communicate amongst themselves. And via these characters, via WhatsApp groups, these children began to truly send themselves messages and send themselves different relief messages, created songs about self-care. So that same universe, the same characters that each child identified with was used, and they allowed the children to have that communication. This universe called The Village allowed us to be in one same channel. And when we started to propose, or when we started to create a aesthetic purpose, a graphical purpose, where each of these characters has their own way of being drawn, and that allowed children to actually use Play-Doh and other types of things that they had at home. They used different crafts, papers, everything, and they were able to recreate many of these characters of the universe and create processes related to creation. And other members of the family also got involved. So basically, I only have 30 seconds left. Basically, the idea of the village was to weave significant connections between that series of family members and those that were scattered throughout this shipwrecked setting, which is COVID-19, and especially make the imagination work, and allowing via these main characters, via their voices, via their stories, via the drawing art, well, the children can actually, one way or another, find support, social, emotional support to actually undertake these difficult moments. For more information, you can enter www.laaldea.co. Thank you very much for the space.
Thank you, Emmanuel. That's an amazing work. We will hopefully have more time to ask you questions. We're going to have more time to ask you questions, and all of the panelists after the interventions, we're going to have 20 minutes for a Q&A. I forgot to tell the audience that. So thank you. So now I have the great pleasure to introduce Diana Abbas. Diana was trained in communication arts. After beginning her career in culture and the private sector, she decided to shift gears and use her skills and potentials to serve social movements. Abbas joined newly formed young feminist groups and actively participated in the development of a creative online publication. After that, she specialized in sexual and reproductive health and rights and began her new journey as a communication expert with Marsa's Sexual Health Center. She then gained more responsibilities to become the executive director of the organization. During her tenure, she has furthered the geographical, community, and thematic outreach of the organization, played a leading role in placing the question of sexual and reproductive health and rights on the agenda of policymakers and donors involved in Lebanon. Welcome, Diana. The floor is yours.
Thank you. We're going to be talking about violence today. And to start with, I would like to acknowledge the extraordinary violence that's happening around many parts of the world, particularly in Colombia and in Palestine. And we should remember in our conversation today and always the impact that this violence has on women and children. I'm going to be sharing my screen today. I will start by sharing with you this picture. It's a photo of the wheat silos in the Beirut port. And I guess you all know about the explosion that happened in Beirut in August 2020. And here we see that the wheat is starting to grow again at the port. And I like to think that this is a reflection of our country against all odds. Today, I'm going to start by sharing some comments about the knowledge brief and its relevance to Lebanon. Then I will talk about the pre-existing conditions and the compounded crises that Lebanon has been facing since 2019. In addition to the feminist mobilization that happened in response to these crises and our vision of a post-pandemic feminism. To begin with, we know that Lebanon has a lot of refugees, and within our humanitarian settings, we have around 400,000 migrant workers, 1 million registered Syrian refugees according to the Unhcr, and 500,000 more that are non-registered according to the Lebanese government, and 200,000 Palestinian refugees, including 300,000 that came from Syria. We have seen an increase in poverty. There's a lot of anger and frustration at the situation and at the pandemic. We have all been cut off from our social networks, and this has resulted in physical and emotional violence. And it has affected our access to healthcare. We had a civil war in Lebanon between 1975 and 1990. And the criminals in the war took over the government and the system, and they are still there. So our whole system is corrupt, and we are paying the price for that today. We have a poor legal system that is biased towards the political parties behind it. We have 17 sects, so women are subjected to the religious laws of these sects. We do not have a secular legal system. We have a weak violence against women law that was adopted in 2014. But for example, it does not criminalize marital rape. We have gender norms that discriminate against anybody who is not conforming in their gender identity or their sexual orientation. And we have patriarchal social institutions that only decide to come together against the most vulnerable, against women, migrant workers, refugees, and the LGBTIQ individuals in Lebanon. Moving on to compounded crises, we still have the broken, corrupt regime that is still around since 1990. We have the economic and banking crisis that started in 2019, where people do not have access to their resources in the bank anymore. COVID-19 began in March 2020, in addition to the Beirut explosion in August 2020. So all of these have resulted together in homelessness. There's a lot of loss of income, and people have also lost their shelters, either because they cannot afford it anymore, or because it was simply destroyed in the explosion as it tore apart a large part of the city. And we have seen that, for example, many individuals from the LGBTQ community have had to move back with their families and into very violent homes. Sexual and reproductive health has fallen down to the bottom of the priorities. You are scared to go to the doctor or to the hospital because of COVID. You do not have the financial means to get healthcare, and you are not covered. And also the government is allocating 400,000 Lebanese pounds to the poorest families, which today in the black market amounts to $30, which is not enough to even buy groceries for 1 week. And all of these have resulted in increased anxiety and depression, while we are facing a major hike in the prices of nutrients and gaps in medication, as the pharmacies are not being given medication from the suppliers anymore. So because of the economic and banking crisis, we have seen political instability. People in Lebanon have been worried about a new civil war, and we have seen a lot of period poverty, as women do not have the resources anymore to buy their own menstrual hygiene products. And we have seen that the government does not think that menstrual hygiene products are important, and they prioritized razors for men instead of these products for women. Because of COVID-19, we have seen a lot of racist attacks, especially against the Syrian refugees, because they are blamed for all the problems that happen in Lebanon. We have multiple lockdowns that have resulted in isolation, and the hotline for protection against domestic violence has been interrupted. It was only through the advocacy of a local organization that it was activated again. Women are carrying a further care burden. In addition to their work, they are also caring for their families. They are working at home, and some of them have lost their jobs as well. The protection schemes are almost non-existent, especially when it comes to refugees and migrants and the LGBTIQ community. The suspension of courts have caused women with cases for asking for custody or alimony or fighting domestic violence have been on hold. And all of these, we have seen so much more increased violence, whether in the public or the private sphere, on the emotional and physical and sexual level. The feminist mobilization was a key in responding to this multitude of crises. We know that there was a local response and advocacy. We know that CAFA worked on having digital codes to ensure that women were getting their rights when it came to litigation. We have the anti-racism movement, which is an NGO that worked on the repatriation of migrant workers who were left out in the streets due to the devaluation of the Lebanese pounds, and the Lebanese employers were not able to pay them anymore. So they were very irresponsible and they just threw them out in the streets. So there was a lot of effort and fundraising done to repatriate them. We have the Unhcr response, which is an initiative by several organizations working on human rights, feminist rights, LGBTIQ rights, and harm reduction. So we started this effort with the beginning of COVID, and then after the Beirut explosion, where we offered shelter and cash, because we also want to maintain the dignity of the individuals that were supporting food aid and medical care, especially for those who needed medical procedures after the Beirut explosion. There was the Feminist Charter, which was an initiative held by UN Women in Lebanon, and many feminist organizations came together to decide on the priorities that we need to work on for women and gender minorities in Lebanon. And we also have Khaddad Beirut, which was an initiative by activists that worked on tackling the healthcare and education and the economy and the environment, especially because of the Beirut explosion and its implications on the Lebanese environment. And when it comes to international advocacy, we're also present in the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, and the Generation Equality Forum. We want to make sure that our feminist voices are heard in international platforms. And actually in Lebanon, we see that it's because of our feminist organizations and civil society and our solidarity together that we were able to fight all of these crises that were happening together. And together now we envision a world where we do not compromise anymore as feminists and as organizations. And we will not accept what was happening before the pandemic, because we have seen the inequalities and we have seen that we only have ourselves to rely on and each other. So this is why, despite everything, we shall prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. That's a very compelling interventions. I have few questions here for you, but we'll leave it for Q&A in after the interventions of Tina and Leloa. So next we have, thank you, we have in our agenda Tina Musuya. Tina has 16 years of experience of working in communities, police, civil society, local government, policymakers, with them, to prevent violence against women. She also led implementation of the successful pilot of SASA, very well known, in Kampala, a groundbreaking initiative that reduced physical intimate partner violence by 52%. She coordinated the development of the Uganda Police Force Domestic Violence Handbook and the Police GBV Training Manual. As a member of Uganda Law Reform Commission Task Force, she helped draft and successfully campaign for passage of the Domestic Violence Act and continues to guide on its implementation. Thank you, Tina, for joining us. We're very excited to hear what you brought to this panel. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arturo. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be in this forum. I'll be speaking to you about family violence prevention experience from Uganda. And I will start by giving you a very quick background of what government's action was. And then I'll also tell you about how we adapted to the situation and also run through some very quick lessons. Can I have the next slide, please? So when COVID struck, our government took very quick action. Of course, there was an instant lockdown, strict curfews. We had military officers stationed on the streets with guns, of course, sending people back home. And then there were work from home orders and a total lockdown or shutdown of public transport, social public spaces such as markets and everything, restricting emergency services to only health with clearance from the authorities. Next slide, please. So from our perspective, the response of our government was not really gender sensitive. It was very gender insensitive. Just like everyone else, violence against women was not considered a priority. And this came with serious consequences to the lives of women and children. Also, sexual reproductive health services were closed. They were also not deemed essential, and women market vendors had to live day and night at their workplace with limited protection. And again, we from the feminist movement, we felt like this was gender blind. And as feminist organizations, we took charge in addressing some of those critical gaps and called our government to take action. Next slide, please. So with this kind of response, organizations working from home, including women's shelters and so on, and everyone else, the consequence was that there was increased burden on women as they did not have access to services. And then, of course, government, listening to us, came up with toll-free lines that police opened up. But again, they were only listening to calls and mediating in cases. Now, this was very dangerous because if women were trapped in the same space with their abusive partners, that could be a risk factor for further violence. And then there was restrictions on shelters that meant that the women who were abused and girls couldn't really access any services. There was no access to those shelters. Next slide, please. So for us as CEDOVIP, we had to adapt quickly to address some of those gaps that we had seen. And because we are a feminist organization, we are always in connection with other feminist groups. We had to have quick conversations and also collaborated to really see who was doing what and how could we use some of the resources that the others had and some of the learnings from across the globe. So we quickly changed our method of work to adapt to the new normal. We had to repackage our program delivery because we knew that the men and women and the children needed this programming of preventing violence. So we repackaged that into electronic versions, and we had a lot of radio campaign, mobile speakers that were airing out violence prevention messages. And we also used the social media platform. And as an organization that does community mobilization work, we have activists stationed within these communities, men and women, who lead the process of change. So now what we had to do was to provide them with PPE and sanitizer, and also encourage them to reach out to their neighbors, of course, in a very safe way, to continue with the violence prevention work. And then we now made sure that we prioritized working on household stressors. So we focused on strengthening couple communication and relationship skills, because that was much needed. Also negotiation skills and listening skills. So amidst all these resource difficulties, the men and women in our communities who had been impacted by our program were able to know that they have a problem of COVID and they have a responsibility to make their relationships work and keep each other safe. So they were able to make decisions about how to manage the mega resources that they had, about food, and then how to support each other during that difficult time, and also to parent their children. We also continue to provide mentoring support to our community activists through online phones, because this was a new thing that happened. They lacked the necessary skills and therefore they needed encouragement. And when you're doing community mobilization work, person-to-person engagement is extremely critical, and relationships. So we could not just keep away. We had to continuously keep in touch with them and also give them useful information on how to prevent COVID-19 and how to also, just like my colleagues have highlighted, we infused self-care into the violence prevention and mindfulness, because people were not really well. We combined violence prevention with COVID-19 prevention measures. We also, because we have referral cards for women who have been abused to access services, these referral cards were quite useful for women to show at the police stop checkpoints. And whenever they saw these referral cards, they would let these women pass. And when these women presented these referral cards in whatever service that they went to, they were quickly supported. We also encouraged community members to speak out and demand proper services from their local government leadership. And then we also ran and increased the emergency fund for the survivors of violence, because during that lockdown time, transport costs were quite high. And that meant that a short journey that would have costed maybe $10 they would be charging $50. So we had to run an emergency fund to support these women to go access the services. And we're in direct contact with all these service points. Next slide, please. So we also have very quick learnings that we would like to share with everyone else. During emergency periods, caregiving burdens women as they are overstretched with responsibilities. All women were complaining about long hours of work. They were combining their office work and their gender roles. And some who, in a traditional set, in a setting like Uganda here, where men don't support women in their domestic chores, it was overwhelming for the women. So self-care is critical and it must be infused into programming. That's a very important aspect when there's a lot of stress. And then during the COVID time, we saw a lot of backlash against gender equality work. Many condemned women while sympathizing with men, stating that women were torturing men in their homes and stressing them, which was the reason as to why men resorted to violence. Can you imagine that? So we feel like the do no harm principle was not prioritized by the emergency response. We still need to stick in there and make sure that whatever work that comes out, the do no harm principle is observed. And in our SASA work, the community-led activism was sustained and created innovative actions as communities felt more unified. They felt like they are together. In Africa, we have what we call the Ubuntu. They felt like this was a COVID problem, and them as a community, they needed to support each other. So they were reaching out to other families and members who were struggling. If they did not have food, then they shared the little food that they had. Then they supported each other to keep well and to parent the children. Some of them lived in these little homes where even social distancing was not possible, but they were checking on each other and supporting each other to keep well. And they used every opportunity to promote violence prevention work. During the food distribution, relief food distribution, our activists made that a point of intervention. If people used to fetch water from a joint collection center, our activists used that as a way of reaching out with violence prevention. So they were quite agile. And I would say feminist approaches really cultivated personal and productive relationships to address systemic inequalities and injustice. This is critical for violence prevention work, because even within this time, the activists were not asking for payment. They felt that it was their responsibility because they knew they cared about everyone else's life. They really had to work together to keep families safe. Thank you very much. That's all that I needed to share with you. Over to you, Arturo.
Thank you for sharing your experiences, Tina. They're great, and hope we can make a little deep dive in some of the learnings you had during these difficult times. But thank you, and all of the panelists, thank you for making this job easy. You're being just on time on your presentation. Thank you. So now we're going to hear experience of Leloa Pahl. She's a Learning Development Officer on GBV in the UNHCR Global Learning and Development Center in Budapest, Hungary. She's an international development and migration policy specialist with in-depth knowledge of cross-cutting gender-based violence, child protection, and community-based protection issues. Leloa has worked for UNHCR in various capacities over the last 11 years. This involved work on child protection, GBV, and GBV information management, work from UNHCR HQ in Geneva as part of an interagency technical team. Her previous field experience includes emergency response as field officer in the protection area in Abou, Kenya, and a roving protection officer based in Costa Rica, focused on work with civil society partners and government authorities in Mexico, Guatemala, Panama, and Costa Rica to establish the regional safe spaces network. Thank you, Leloa, for joining this panel. We're very excited to learn from your experiences. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Arturo. And thank you very much to everyone who was part of the event organization team. Very well organized and really a pleasure to be a part of this panel. Thank you to the colleagues for inviting UNHCR to participate, also because it's such a timely issue. And the release of the knowledge brief, I'd just like to congratulate the authors. And it's an excellent document that we are definitely using and happy to have contributed to that as UNHCR. And also from the perspective of the partnership and the program and UNHCR's participation in that partnership, we're happy to continue this kind of work. And I'd like to just speak to all of you who joined us today on a few things that UNHCR is experiencing, the ongoing challenges. Also give a few examples of interventions and talk about what we're asking as UNHCR when we're talking to states, when we're talking to donors, when we're talking to private citizens. So if you've joined in any of those capacities, what you can do, and the great work that's being done by partners. UNHCR works in partnership with so many organizations, and just really want to say thank you to the other panelists. I'm fascinated by what Emmanuel has described. Really powerful to be so creative in that approach to child protection work. And also Tina, thank you. Nice to hear about how SASA has to be adapted and adapting prevention measures. And Diana as well, talking about the compounded crises that exists in Lebanon, and we know the challenges associated. Goleen talked a lot about the statistics. So I'd like to focus on what you're already aware of here, but really to say that these challenges are ongoing, that creativity is essential. So many disruptions have occurred, significant challenges to accessing GBV services. So when we look at the knowledge brief and we see that this type of violence, intimate partner violence, violence against children is preventable, then it gives us a ground to stand on to really focus limited resources. And when we see, for example, disruptions to health services and the closure of safe spaces in order to protect against the spread of COVID-19, we know that these are things that we can address. And that helps us to also look at where we can be stronger in our points of advocacy together as a larger community as we're doing this work. And that sharp increase in intimate partner violence against women and girls really shapes this conversation as we're talking about protection of forcibly displaced women and girls within UNHCR. Yes, we work, of course, with men and boys and recognize that they can also be survivors of gender-based violence. Intimate partner violence, our LGBTIQ plus brothers and sisters as well, if they're trapped within the household now in the context of COVID-19, how this affects their outlook, their ability to also enjoy their rights, their human rights. And these are the elements within the context of forced displacement that we want to really focus those innovative and remote modalities we're trying to work with. We have to do that. Really, these crises are the mother of invention. And we can see there's a need for more online tools and updated guidance, expanded community mechanisms, and the challenges that are inherent there. Goleen outlined well the concerns we have about low connectivity areas. What do you do way out of the urban context in the rural areas where even mobile phone costs are exorbitantly expensive? So these are the things that we're worried about, together with our concerns around the cost of transportation, was what Tina mentioned, being able to access services, and the limited access to livelihoods, income generating activities, the cost of mobile phone services, which might also prevent you from being able to do your banking online, even if it's just receiving a little bit of cash. These challenges, and it's expected now with COVID-19 that there will be severe long-term impacts on the protection of refugees and internally displaced women and girls. So I'd just like to share with you a few examples. I have many, so I will do my best to focus them. Please, in the question and answer afterwards, I think that would be a good time to elaborate on them. So if you'll allow me to highlight a few, just please ask and then I can elaborate more. We're very much interested in gender responsive interventions. GBV prevention, risk mitigation response, that comprehensive set of interventions. So yes, the family violence prevention and the understanding of what the intersectional characteristics are of specific individuals, and looking at the knowledge brief, having that kind of research to contribute to where to focus our efforts. Also in terms of risk mitigation, when we talk to our government counterparts, and we think as UNHCR together with partners, what are we doing for persons of concern to look at national systems and to have better access to national systems as well. We're innovating to enhance support to displaced women and girls and promoting the leadership of women and girls throughout the response. And a few examples there. I wanted to talk about forcibly displaced women's leadership in the response. I like the example from Syria, where UNHCR partners are working with a network of 91 women committees across 12 different governorates. And women committees have shared information on COVID-19 prevention, and also they include legal information, medical service information, and they work closely with the GBV community prevention focal points in community centers. So this work being women-led. In India, part of the GBV child protection response, 173 female refugee volunteers were provided with mobile phones to spread awareness on GBV, so as a risk mitigation measure, and looking at child protection and sexual exploitation and abuse messaging there. They were also able to provide psychological first aid and act as focal points for safe disclosure of GBV. In Kenya, I wanted to share an example also of a refugee-led organization that UNHCR supported. And they were developing a series of 6 animated videos in order to talk about COVID and also GBV risks in the context of COVID, including intimate partner violence, including violence against children. And this was then together with the National Council of Persons with Disabilities, put into Braille and put into posters. So this is an example that I like, that I think you would appreciate as well, the effort there to be as inclusive as possible in reaching out with this message. In terms of Yemen, UNHCR's partners engaged refugee and IDP women in the production of non-medical face masks, and that as an income generating activity, and also being able to do that in the comfort of their homes where they are less exposed within the informal market, informal labor market, to particular kinds of GBV risks. Remote and innovative service delivery modalities, just to mention a few, really thinking of that low connectivity issue again, out in Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire. There were targeted campaigns using Instagram, using Facebook, but also using rural radios. So radio stations out in areas where there wasn't high connectivity, and helping to disseminate messages on services, also GBV services that were available, and how to complain if there was a sexual exploitation and abuse situation. Jordan, this is a good example of something that was also highlighted in the knowledge brief, where out-of-camp refugees in the urban context were able to safely disclose incidents of GBV at pharmacies. So looking for alternative ways when it's very challenging, especially with mobility restrictions in the context of COVID, to reach out and receive services. A couple of examples here, just noting the time. I would say Mexico, the information campaigns on GBV risks using WhatsApp, online platforms. I mentioned radio before. I would just mention one more thing under strengthening the response for Zimbabwe, preventing violence against women and girls, in consultation with them, having dialogues with the men in the community about transformational behavior change. And just to mention a couple of things, and I see I'm running over, so I'll do this quickly. But for states, thanks, Arturo, and states here, really full participation of women and girls This is also highlighted in the recommendations of the knowledge brief. In the COVID response plans, also when we are talking about access to sexual and reproductive health services, social protective services, making sure that we maintain those services and designate them as essential, and access to legal services and access to justice for women and girls in a safe manner. Donors, funding for GBV subsectors, humanitarian appeals, to maintain that percentage, whatever it is. So even if the appeal isn't fulfilled entirely, whatever amount of the appeal is fulfilled, also we ask that donors keep that percentage of GBV funding and prioritize funding to women-led organizations. And I think Diana makes a very good point for that. Including those led by refugee women and girls. And private citizens really help raise awareness about the risk of GBV faced by women and girls in forced displacement contexts, and helping them to raise their voices and advocating with governments and advocating for legal and policy amendments that help to include them in the response, everything connected to COVID. So thank you. I'll stop there, and really just to say UNHCR works in partnership, and we're just so pleased to continue this kind of partnership that brings that evidence base to a much higher level on forced displacement. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leloa. As you said, lots and lots of things, lots of experiences. Let's see if we have time to go in depth in one of those. So now we're gonna have this Q&A space. We have 20 minutes budgeted for this. I think we have a little bit less. So I've been consolidating the list of questions, and I'm gonna go with specific questions for each of our panelists, thinking on what will come from there. So the first question is from Ana Maria Restrepo for Emmanuel. The question is La Aldea easily scalable to other contexts or other situations beside COVID? Emmanuel?
Yes, well, the village or aldea was a woven universe that allows us to deploy a curriculum, personalized curriculum and emergency curriculums. For example, here in certain violence areas in Colombia, violence-prone areas, we work in Nariño, which is an area where last year we had several massacres, and La Aldea, or the village, published certain things about how to deal with grief and accompanying communication in that regard. In the Guajira region, which is a desert area in the northern part of Colombia, we work quite a bit on taking care of the environment and water. With COVID, we wove in some curriculum about the vaccine as well, and about the virus in general, and about confinement. So that universe called Aldea, or the village, allows the real world, or create situations that are a mirror to the real world within the curriculum, that allows us to be able to expand the universe. And apart from that, La Aldea is a multi-platform curriculum. We're working right now with the Lego Foundation and IOC in deploying a radio program for migrants with Enrique Camaleon, which is a migrant character in the Aldea. He's going to have his own talk show, or his radio show. And we're beginning a TV program as well. So the idea is to be able to weave a transmedia platform with books, with radio, with digital media, with objects from early childhood all the way to 14 years of age, to be able to use these stories to cater to the needs of people and connect them to the educational system as well. What we're doing is we're actually crossing this with the Ministry of Education's standards and benchmarks. And with this, we actually ensure that the material that is done with La Aldea, or the village, work for the formal educational and non-formal educational system. So it's a curriculum that is adaptable, and there's 40 stories so far, and we hope that we'll have many more to come to accompany families and children. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Now that you're talking about connections, I'm going to jump to English right now.
Connecting. You mentioned this in your the start of your talk, and this question is for Diana about connecting, because of your work and what have you done? This is a key issue. So in this very difficult context where you are, this compounded crisis context, and this, yeah, where all of the actors are stretching their capabilities, in your experience, how or which were the best strategies to connect to official protection services and to healthcare services? Official in terms of, well, government or NGOs, or how to create those bridges and how to engage with the government. Was it during COVID, obviously during this extra additional crisis? How did it go?
Thank you, Arturo. I think we as the Lebanese, we know that we can never rely on our government, and we rely a lot of civil society to provide us with the services that we need and the support we need. So as organizations, we work closely with the ministries. For example, for our case, it's the Ministry of Public Health, Education, Social Affairs, and we collaborate together so that we can have a complementary system and where we don't leave anybody behind. When it came to COVID, we immediately started coordinating together because we knew the vulnerability of our communities, we knew where the gaps were, and we engaged together through donors from outside Lebanon, because Lebanon is now a bankrupt country, and before that we didn't even get any funding from the government. So usually when we work with the government, it's quote unquote moral support or like facilitation to organize, but we rely on our partners and the Lebanese diaspora to support us in the work we do. When it came to the Beirut explosion, we also had to work closely together, and it was an organic reaction by the people residing in Lebanon, from the Lebanese to the Syrians, the Palestinians, and even the migrant workers who came to the aid of those who were affected by the explosion. So our reactions are from the communities, and we had to organize within a complete absence from the government, from the security forces. Nobody was helping the people who were under the rubble, and we still did not hear until this day, almost a year later, an apology from anybody in a position of leadership or in a position of responsibility in the government. So in this sense, we work together as a civil society, as academic institutions, and we advocate together for change. And as the example I was giving with the Feminist Charter, for the example, we as feminist organizations draft the agendas we want to work on, and we advocate together to push the government to support us in the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Diana. So now I'm going to jump and ask a question to Tina about the adaptations that you had to come up with during the pandemic. And I wanted to ask if you have some specific innovations or adaptations that you think that are here to stay in terms of identifying cases or collecting data or delivery or provision, service provision or use of technology, whatever.
Thank you. About the adaptations, of course, some of them will be here to stay. Take, for instance, the issue of self-care and mindfulness that we cannot run away from. And then also concentrating on building the relationship skills and negotiation skills of partners. That has to stay. And again, we have these very vibrant young people who are so active on the social media platforms. I think that one will also stay. Even though in Uganda, not very many people can access that, but I think that those are innovations that really have to stay. So that will be a hybrid, the new innovations plus what was already ongoing. I think that's all I can add. Thanks.
Thank you, Tina. And this has something to do with the innovations. This question is for Leloa about the role of community agents. So you mentioned that they played an important part in remote service delivery. And one of the biggest questions about, okay, now in this social, in this situation where all of the social ties are and contact is eliminated, how do you support and train community agents? Because it's not about just giving them the role, it's also about providing them with the necessary tools to do the job correctly. How did you come about on that, or what challenges did you face in this aspect?
Yes, thank you. I think that's an interesting question. When we see the regional disparities across UNHCR, we have to take this into account as well. The different ways that community engagement has developed and being a part of different types of responses has definitely been organic in many places, less imposed or via project funding, and much more emerging because of a desire on the ground by those who are in the community, if it's the refugee community, IDP community, that they want to see something happen. They can see the gap and there's an attempt to fill it. And then as international community actors, be it UN agencies or NGOs, international, national NGOs, community-based organizations, this work that's critical for us to recognize, to take the time to have the dialogues and to really support initiatives that are already ongoing. When we look for what's happening in terms of national systems, and where we see that there is a functioning healthcare system, for example, that there is a service that people could potentially go to, maybe the missing link for there to be access to those services just has to do with there being enough community outreach volunteers that are willing to move forward. The effort that we promote in the places where this functions, it doesn't function everywhere because that is something that takes a lot of energy and requires relationship building, like Tina was saying. Those relationships are key. We have a lot of staff turnover in UNHCR because of the nature of the emergency. So we need those relationships that build over time. What you want to do is to incorporate in any training aspect. If it's just health outreach workers, but maybe also it's water, sanitation, hygiene outreach. Can you integrate GBV risk messages into that effort? So not losing any opportunity if it's a group of volunteers that is specifically for health, not deciding that then we can't work with that group, rather than looking for those opportunities if it's through a certain kind of distribution, and looking for alternatives and adapting quickly based on where the restrictions are, movement restrictions, and looking for other ways to try and bring the community in wherever possible.
And there's one question from the audience, and I think we have a minute for that. So the question is for Leloa about if you could describe UNHCR's measures or actions to address violence against children on the move with some detail. I know it's very short time, but just to.
Sure. I would want to ask the individual who asked the question if they had a region in mind, because we could definitely push that in the direction of a certain region. If we're talking about children on the move and we're thinking of Northern Central America,
Colombia,
for example, Colombia. Gracias. Okay, so moving from Colombia and moving in different directions too. If we're thinking about those who intend to move north or those who intend to move outside of Colombia but remain in South America. I think we can talk about a lot of the work with national systems. We try as much as possible, especially in the Americas, to not create parallel systems, to very much look at which services are available and building on those services. And we know that there are so many challenges to from underreporting of that violence, or also with being able to, for children to be able to access services on their own. These challenges, we try to have different partners in different areas working in partnership, but particularly looking at what national systems are. And this is part of the challenge with COVID, and looking at how we have to change and adapt to being able to use online devices and in a safe way, so it isn't over social media that's unprotected, and looking at ways that communication, if it's through hotlines, how to connect those children as quickly as possible and look at the life-saving aspects that provides.
Thank you, Leloa. And I wish we would have more time. We're over 1 minute and a half already, and I don't want to take advantage of the great generosity of the panelists and of the audience for being here. Just I only have to give you our very sincere thank you. Thank you for the Colombia team, Columbia University team and the team from Los Andes for helping getting this event together. And thanking again the panelists for your time and for sharing your great experiences. We hope that this collective work can keep going forward. Thank you very much. And I think this has to be a goodbye for now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Here you can find the knowledge brief in this link.
Ya estamos fuera del aire en Facebook.
Okay, we're off the air in Facebook. Great.
Podemos poner el link del knowledge.
Can we put the knowledge brief link on the Facebook page as well?
Claro que sí.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Camila.
Y podemos poner este link en el chat acá.
And can we put the link in the chat here as well?
Leloa, Emmanuel, muchas
Leloa
gracias.
and Emmanuel, thank you very much. Tina, thank you so much. To you, Diana, thank you. Thank you all.
Muy interesante. Creo que queda uno
Very interesting. I think that after these events,
con ganas de
you get like a desire to have an additional hour with each of the panelists to speak a bit more, at least an hour with each of you.
a little tasting.
Sí, y para mí es
And for me,
es algo un poco triste, porque
it's somewhat sad because normally we can go out and drink a cup of coffee and talk a little bit more in the halls, but great. The event was very well organized. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Gracias por en verdad por
Oh,
compartir.
thank you for sharing.
Fundamental para eso era.
It was fundamental.
Muchas gracias por el tiempo que sabemos que
And
es
thank you for the time. We know that all of your times are scarce.
Deseo que te sientes mejor.
And I hope you feel better. Yes, I'm getting there. Tylenol, The Taliban bump is.
Bien hecho.
Do we have
Okay,
to?
entonces, hasta luego. Sí.
Okay, so see you later. I'm gonna say goodbye. See you next time.
Estamos en contacto, Emmanuel.